where I think I'll begin is something that we actually don't spend a lot of time on this show, and I don't remember us doing so. In the last year or two, we haven't really talked about this. I know you've been tracking what's going on in the African continent with the U.S. military through AFRICOM, and you've been following what's happening in Ethiopia and with Eritrea. So I feel like let's begin with a topic that has been not discussed here at Unauthorized Disclosure, and let's just hear first, what you've been following with AFRICOM.
The U.S. African Command was started under the George W. Bush administration in 2007, and it was proclaimed to be a project that was not pushing military bases or the U.S.'s military presence in Africa per se, but it was supposed to be a so-called joint collaboration between African countries and the United States to promote both the U.S.'s national security interests, quote unquote, and the interests of countries on the continent. Now, when it first was proposed, the U.S. African Command was heavily opposed by the vast majority of African states. But when Obama was elected in 2008, a lot of things changed. The pressure to support the U.S. African Command, or at least to allow it to expand, was extremely high. And what we saw over the next 8 years was a massive expansion of the U.S. military presence on the African continent. At this moment, 53 of 54 countries on the continent have direct military to military relationships with the U.S. African Command. Only Eritrea is without any relationship to AFRICOM. And what's really important to trace here, because I know you all have been following the U.S. airstrikes in Somalia, for example, and this growth of instability on the African continent. What's really important to follow with the U.S. African Command is how instability in Africa has actually risen since AFRICOM has expanded its tentacles on the African continent. It is quite clear that the U.S.'s military relationship with Africa is colonial in character and reinforces what Kwame Nkrumah, the founder of African independence and the first president of independent Ghana, called neocolonialism. And we see that quite clearly when it comes to these recent multiple airstrikes, the drone strikes on Somalia. Somalia has a long history with the United States' military, from the Operation Restore Hope in 1993, which created a puppet government situation in order to siphon Somali oil and other resources away from the country and to gain a geopolitical foothold there. And then, of course, if we talk about the Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, the Horn of Africa situation as a whole, we know that the United States backed Ethiopia's vicious invasion, violent invasion in 2006, which killed tens of thousands of people and created a warlord situation, which the CIA has been propping up ever since. So these drone strikes, the expansion of the military in Africa and the hundreds of joint special operations which happen on the continent, and the attendant instability, and we can get into AFRICOM's first operation, Libya, in 2011, they all serve the same purpose. It is to continue this colonial process, the domination of Africa and its precious resources in the hands of U.S. and Western corporations. And it is also, as you mentioned, Kevin, to contain China, because China has surpassed the United States and the West in general in terms of its trade relationship with Africa by many counts, with China now having a volume of upwards of close to $300 billion, the U.S. More than 5 times less than that. So there is this geopolitical purpose of militarizing the African continent in order to maintain the US's dominance around the world. And Africa is just one location, a very important strategic location from which that domination is attempted to be reasserted.
Yeah, and what's interesting is what's happening right now in the Horn of Africa, which is pretty, blatantly the US and some of its allies, other actors trying to essentially destabilize Africa's second most populous country, which is Ethiopia. It has received quite a bit of attention in US and Western media, but only in the context of Ethiopia is committing evil atrocities against this group in Tigray called the TPLF. But there's no really broader explanation of actually what led to the current fighting in Ethiopia and how the US actually kind of has encouraged that fighting to continue. But can you talk a little bit about that? Because you mentioned Ethiopia's role in Eritrea back in the early 2000s and in invading that country. Actually, no, let's start with Eritrea, because I'd like to know from your perspective, because you mentioned Eritrea is the only country on the continent that isn't an AFRICOM. Can you talk a little bit first about why Eritrea is so isolated and so alienated and so demonized by the West? Because the West does portray Eritrea as though it's this uniquely repressive country where human rights violations take place. It's just so awful, as though America's allies across the African continent don't commit human rights atrocities with regularity. So can you talk a little bit about that? What is it about Eritrea that has caused it to be so demonized by Western countries?
Well, Eritrea takes an independent position, both in its domestic and foreign policy. And there is always a lot of difficulty in talking about Eritrea because the African continent as a whole is largely ignored by most journalists, activists, those who call themselves on the so-called anti-war left. There's a lot of misinformation and a lot of lack of information about what is going on in the African continent as a whole. So a tiny country like Eritrea often gets ignored. But the fact of the matter is that Eritrea's independent position and its independent politics in the region are very important and signal the reason why the U.S. is so hostile toward it. Eritrea was under sanctions for many years up until the peace agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea in 2018, and the U.S. has ratcheted up aggression ever since toward Eritrea, accusing it of supposedly invading Tigray, for example, despite the fact that the Ethiopian government provided permission for Eritrea to be able to station troops along the border because of the very real threat that the TPLF has represented for many, many, many years. The TPLF is not a new phenomenon, despite what Western media say that they are. The TPLF was the ruling party in Ethiopia for many, many, many years after the fall of the Derg, the socialist government in Ethiopia after the fall of the Soviet Union. So the TPLF has a long history from the brutal invasion of Somalia in 2006 and onward of vicious policies toward ethnic minorities and a real friendly relationship to the West and the United States. And Eritrea opposes that. It opposes interference of the United States in the region. It opposes the way that the United States and its Western allies seek to divide the African continent, especially the Horn of Africa, in order to try and strip its precious but still limited and underdeveloped resources from the region. And its overall policy is one of fostering cooperation and regional cooperation. And that's been especially ratcheted up since Ethiopia and Eritrea reached the peace agreement after the election of Abiy Ahmed in 2018. And onward, we've seen Somalia, we've seen Djibouti, we've seen Ethiopia and Eritrea attempt to come together and foster some sort of alliance so that the United States and the West does not have the capacity to divide these countries against each other and foster a real hostile and unstable political climate from which nothing positive or productive can get done for the African people and for the people of that region.